Hello everybody, welcome to another one of our deck techs. Today we are going to have a look at Sidar Jabari as our commander, and we're trying to upgrade the Cavalry Charge Commander deck from March to the Machine. This deck is really cool. It has a lot of very strong synergy with the commander itself, given the fact that he has Eminence and a lot of useful things that it can help with the whole tribal of knights in general. The purpose of the series is basically for us to go into analyzing what upgrades we can do to our precon decks if you have the cards for it. So realistically, our guys don't go into depth of here's the list and here's what you should play. It's more an open-ended discussion of these are the cards that would really synergize with the commander and with the deck as a whole. This is how we would try and build as a generic theme the commander deck. Therefore, we try and give you as many options as we can, and then depending on what your wallet allows and what your collections have and so on and so forth, you can decide whatever cards you want to play in. So this is really important, and yeah, we hope you'll enjoy this guide as well. So let's have a look first off at Sidar Jabari proper. In case you don't remember, he is the commander, he is a knight, he's a 4/3 knight, and his main abilities are the fact that he has eminence, so whenever he is in commander zone or whenever he is in battlefield, and whenever you attack with one or more knights, you draw a card basically, and then discard a card, so you loot. And the second ability is that whenever he deals combat damage to a player, you can return any knight from the graveyard onto the battlefield. So that's really good. And also, this is a strong commander because of many reasons. First off, it's a cheap caster. It's 4 to cast overall, so it's 1 generic and then Esper. And also, it's very strong because there are a couple of things that we'll be able to do, as you'll see, with the fact that whenever it deals combat damage, you can return stuff from the graveyard. So anyway, before we go on to the main creatures, which is basically what we think that the deck should be focused on, because in the end it's a creature tribal deck, I wanted to bring the attention to one important part, which is an enchantment that we brought up while we were discussing the deck proper in its own unboxing. And this enchantment is Reconnaissance, right? Reconnaissance is a little white enchantment that costs 1 white that allows you for 0, so for free, to remove an attacking creature from combat and untap it, and that creature deals neither damage nor is dealt damage during combat. So this is a really important piece of the puzzle as to why we're going on to enchantments as a whole. And this plays in with the main commander because of the fact that first strike or double strike, the first damage that you deal against anything that's not a first striker or double striker, so even against players or other creatures, is very important because you can then remove him from combat before the second the normal combat damage is assigned, so not the first strike damage, but the normal combat damage is assigned. So therefore, if you're putting the commander against, I don't know, a creature that doesn't have first strike, the commander will deal damage first, and then you can remove him from combat and you won't get any damage from something that's bigger, so it could kill the creature first, or even more so if it's attacking a player, and for whatever reason the player can remove it from combat or deal it damage during combat, then you can just zero and remove it and still get the effects that we are looking for. So that's really good. So this is why we're starting with enchantments first. And now, since this is a white deck, most of the white decks that we recommend you play with have Smothering Tithe. Smothering Tithe is one of the great ramps for white because it allows you to continuously get treasure tokens. So that's really good. And of course, once you get to a certain point in the game, people will be able to pay the 2 generic cost, but realistically, at the beginning of the game, they'll be more interested in getting their own commanders off and their decks off, and that can really quickly allow you to ramp into whatever you might want. And then next up, we have a very interesting enchantment called the Reflection of Lijara. And this is an enchantment that allows to interact with the tribe aspect of our deck. As you'll see, there are many cards that interact with the tribe aspect of the deck. And this is one that allows you to copy any spell of that specific chosen type. So, for example, you cast a knight with this, you just copy that spell and you get the second knight. Now, of course, if you're casting a legendary and this does not remove the legendary status, this means that you don't really get two of the same really good legendary cards, so you don't get two commanders, for example, but what you do get is any other non-legendary card gets a copy of it, and that's really, really good. Next up, we have the History of Benalia. And this is a very basic but very, very cool saga enchantment that allows to, well, create knight tokens and then buff out all the knights that you control with the third step of the lore. It's a great little thing that definitely can be played even at the end when you've gone really wide and you want to hit your opponents for a lot. Let's say you have 10 knights on the floor and you want to make their bodies much bigger with many of the things that we have in the deck, and then you just top it off with this and it's just wonderful, you know, simple but effective, just like most of the knight cards are. Next up, because of Esper, because of the colors, you can make use of others very good enchantments, and one of them is the Ristic Study. And this allows you to draw cards whenever an opponent casts a spell, unless they pay one generic. And of course, this card is not bad at all, as anybody would know that plays Commander, because it allows you to get so much card advantage. And remember, your Commander allows you to draw cards whenever you attack with a Knight at any one point, right? And again, with Reconnaissance, you can remove him out of combat, but you can still get the trigger of the draws, and this piles up with extra draws. And of course, who doesn't want more card advantage, right? So Ristic Study is a definite keep in mind. And then you have Teferi's Ageless Insight, and another card that works really well with the extra draw steps that we are getting through our commander and through our synergies that we're trying to build, because this allows you to draw an extra card on top of the second draw of the turn. So this, or more of the turn. So this is insane with this kind of deck because of the way that our commander works. And I mean, again, more card advantage, more card draw, really, really good. Next up, we have the Etchings of the Chosen, something that we saw with Brimans. And it literally is a tribal upgrade. It allows to give you all the creatures of a specific type +1/+1, and then you can sacrifice a creature of the specific type by paying one generic, and then give indestructible to another creature you control. So that is a really, really good tribal enchantment, and I believe that it would be worth playing. And another draw engine that you can use as an enchantment is the Phyrexian Arena, even though its cost is 1 and 2 black, so it can be kind of tricky to shoot off if you have it in your hand straight from the beginning. It is still a good draw engine. Okay, next up, another great enchantment that plays really well with a tribal is the Kindred Discovery, and this is a fairly decent enchantment that allows you to draw even more cards. So you are giving knights not only the power to draw not only when your opponents are drawing or whenever a knight is attacking, but you get a double attack trigger to draw. So that's really, really good. And again, with Reconnaissance, you're just gonna you know, if you don't want to sacrifice a creature card that because the board state doesn't allow you to exchange or attack somebody that's really dangerous, you can take them out of combat and still trigger these. So that's really, really good. Now, moving on to the tribal proper and looking at the knights. The realistic number of cards in a tribal deck that you want depends really on yourself as creatures, but I find that the sweet spot is around the 30-ish mark. So when you have 30-ish creatures, it tends to allow you to do the engine that you want to be doing really, really well and not flood with any other things. So if you get around, you know, 28, 29 is still okay. But 30 is kind of the sweet spot. Sometimes I go for 31. So keep that in mind when you're removing the cards that we said in the previous guide that weren't so great, and when you want to add these cards, because these creatures that we're telling you here are not necessarily all, oh my god, you need to add them 100%, but they're more of, okay, well, you can build it this way or that way. And of course, you could just take the list that we give you here and just dump it in, but there are decent cards in the deck proper, so don't just copy the cards from here. Now, first off, I would like to start with a small addendum. If you skip through to this point to look at the creatures, I would advise you to look at the enchantments, namely because the first enchantment that we talk about synergizes a lot with this next type of creature that we will be discussing, and that's why we went with enchantments first on this video. So the first type of creature that we'll want to have is knights that have first strike or double strike, because in general they are a great advantage against other creatures, and knights tend to have a lot of first strikers and quite a few double strikers to boot. But the main idea behind this is because of reconnaissance. Again, if you can get it, if you can tutor it, or you just play it, it allows you to do a lot more damage for free than your opponents would think. And so therefore, we start off in non-particular order and look at some of the possible first strikers and double strikers that we will want to use for this deck. And of course, there are some that are very strong and some that are on the lower end of the power scale. So it's up to you really to see which ones you feel like you can play, you can swap in, and which ones you can really afford, because some of them tend to be on the more expensive scale. So let's start off with the Triumphant Adventurer. This is a simple death touch 1/1 creature, and it gains that first strike as long as it's your turn. And this is really, really good because it's a death toucher. So that's really, really good. And you won't be using it defensively, but you will be using it offensively. Whenever it attacks, you know, you can always venture into a dungeon. And again, reconnaissance, you can do this whole shebang of attacking, death touch, first strike, and it doesn't get any damage dealt, which makes him a strong contender when you're attacking. So that's really nice. And again, the trigger happens when you attack. So that's nice. Another one is the Sigil Paladin, as a 2/2 uncommon card. It's a 4-strike exalted. You know, it's a simple knight. It's kind of like, you know, 2/2 for 2. It's an okay body. It has exalted, so whenever you know, a creature you control attacks alone, it gets +1/+1. So there are maybe cases that you want that one creature because it has first strike and you have reconnaissance, or whatever the reason might be, that you want to attack with one and it gets +1/+1 extra. Not on the greater scale of, oh my god, this is an amazing card, you need to absolutely get it, but it's one card that is not bad. Another okay one is the Silverblade Paladin, which is a 2/2 human knight. It gets soulbound, so you can pair the creature with another creature that's not been paired, and they remain paired so long as they're both under your control. And you know, it gives double strike to whatever paired creature you might have. And this is really good for example, Sidar Jabari, because our commander really wants to have the first strike and a double strike, and this really, really helps him with that. So that's really nice. And another great addition, which I think is a must-have for this deck, is the Kingsbale Cavalier, which I don't understand why they didn't reprint in into this specific deck. Because I mean, maybe it would have made the deck a bit too powerful because it's already really strong as a precon. But yeah, this knight just gives double strike to all creatures, knights that you control, and that's it. This is amazing. It doesn't matter that it costs 4 and it's only a 2/2. You want to safeguard him. You want to give him indestructible if possible, because this will play a long way into making you a danger on the board, no matter how many knights you have and how small they are. So definitely a card to have. Also, the photo of the image is really cool. The guy's having a lot of fun on that goat, so I definitely props for that. Next up, if you don't have the previous card, you can use Gwende, the Pride of Emereth. That gives double strike to himself, and it gives double strike to creatures that have first strike that you control. So again, not bad. It's a way to give double strike for 2 more creatures, and again, we're talking about quite a few first strikers here. I was still trying to get the first one, so I was still trying to get the Kingsbale Cavalier, but Gwende is still a good addition to the deck, and why not? Another good first striker and life linker is Fiend's Slayer Paladin. It's a human knight first strike life linker, and it has protection. It can be the target of black or red spells your opponent's control. It doesn't really have protection, but it's a simple first strike life linker. Again, it's more, if you don't have any of the better ones, you can always just slide this one in, and at least you have some first strikers. Just like Danitha Kapashin, the Paragon is a 2/2 Vigilance first strike life linker knight. And attachments and arcs cost 1 less for you to cast, 1 generic less. The second part, we're not really interested unless you build an equipment knight deck. But it is a 2/2 first striker vigilance life linker. As I said, if you're needing first strikers and you're looking for bodies, this is one to add. Of course, the 2 strong ones that we said before take prevalence over this one. Next up, you have another example. That's the Mirran Crusader. So this is a 2/2 that gets double strike and protection from black and from green. So this one actually has protection. Simple body, double striker, and it's a knight. Why not? Second one is the Phyrexian Crusader, which is the Zombie Knight. It's a 2/2 first striker with protection from red and from white, and it has Infect. So this is really good because, again, you can just reconnaissance with this and put the Infect tokens or the poison tokens and just get it out of combat if necessary. So decent knight to play if you're looking for first strikers. Another okay one that is nothing to shout about, but still is something that if you're looking for first strikers, a student of warfare. It's a 1/1, and then you can power him up, you can level it up, and so long as you level him up to level 2, he gets first strike. I wouldn't say that you absolutely need to get him to the double strike level, which is 7 or more, but if you're flooding, if you have nothing better to do with your mana, then definitely you can just power it up and make him into potential 8 damage. But realistically, it's not one of the better knights. Still, it's a body that you could play. Another knight that I wish we could play, unfortunately, silver boarded cards, they're not allowed, is the Knight of the Kitchen Sink, which has first strike protection from black borders. Yeah, this one would definitely kill. Unfortunately, Watsy didn't want us to play with a silver boarded knight, so that's a little sprinkle for you. Now, moving on to the other kind of knights that can synergize with the whole deck. We can start, and again, in no particular order, we'll just look at the knights that we get here, and then we see what we can or cannot add to the deck and what we want to keep. So for example, Glen Elendra Liege is a decent knight that buffs up other blue creatures and black creatures, and also it has flying. And for Dimir, you can cast it, whatever one of the colors you may have. It's not one of the best knights, but it still allows you to buff up black and blue creatures. and it has flying, and knights with flying are pretty good, so that's always good to have. Next up, we have a similar knight, and this one is the Thistledown Liege, and this one buffs up white and blue creatures. So there you go. Similar to that, allows for tribal, and it's only creatures you control, so that's always good. And it has flash, so you can cast them in on your opponent's turns, on a defense maybe step, and that's always very nice when you're blocking. Or if not, you can just cast it in your turn and you get something out of it. Then a decent knight that was introduced with a Warhammer deck is the Sisters of Silence. This one is a counterspell basically that is also a knight, so it's a 3/3 creature for 4 generic and 1 blue. You can flash it, and you can counter a target instant spell, sorcery, or activated ability or trigger ability when it enters the battlefield. So it has to resolve, but at the same time, it's not a bad card to have. It's an extra counter that you can do, and since you're going tribal, you definitely, I mean, you could, if you wanted to play Force of Will and counters, you could go for that. But realistically, you'll want to just focus a lot on the tribal aspect of your deck. So this allows you to at least have some counter power in case you do draw it. Okay, next up we have another tribal buffer, and this one is the Metallic Mimic, and it's a tricky creature because if you read the description of what it does, you might not think that it can help tribal. So let's go into the description real quickly. It's a 2/1 artifact creature shapeshifter for 2 generic, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you choose a type, and it becomes the type that you choose on top of its other chosen types. And then each other creature you control with a chosen type enters with the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Now, you could think that an additional one translates as it has to have an initial +1/+1 counter, but actually, all it means is that if it did have a +1/+1 counter, that it gets an extra +1/+1 counter, and if it didn't have any, it still gets an extra +1/+1 counter. So this allows you to add counters to all your knights, and it's a really, really strong addition to this kind of deck. Next up, we have the Guardian of Faith, and this is an interesting creature. It's a 3/2 for 1 generic and 2 white. It has flash and vigilance, and whenever it enters the battlefield, phase out any number of creatures. And since you tend to have quite a bit of ETBs, it's quite good to be able to phase out your creatures. On top of that, this allows you to Teferi's protection your creatures, and just in case somebody's targeting or board wiping, you can always just phase them out, and that's really, really good. Next up, we have the Battle Angels of Tyr. This is a 4/4 Angel Knights with 2 generic and 2 white. It has flying, of course, and it has Myriad, which is really, really good. And that allows you to create multiple copies of it when attacking, and allows you to attack all the opponents at once. And then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card, and if that player has more cards in hand than each other player, and then you can create a treasure token if the player controls more lands than each other player, and then you gain 3 life if that player has more life than each other player. So basically, this can multiply because it has Myriad. So you can always try and get those triggers. Of course, if you're the player that has the most of everything, then you don't get the triggers, but you could always just get 1 or 2 triggers per combat up until the board stabilizes. So that's really, really good. Another interesting creature that is not a knight but synergizes really well with this deck is the Council of 4. This is a human noble creature. It's a 0/8. So definitely not something that you're going to buff up and attack with. For 3 generic and 1 white and 1 blue. And whenever a player draws a second card during their turn, you draw a card, right? So again, you're drawing the second card on your turn. It's any player with thanks to your commander. And of course, other players will be having draw engines or draw steps extra because of the cards that they're playing. So that's really, really good. You get to draw extra cards. And then whenever they cast a second spell during their turn, including yourself, you get to create a 2/2 knight. So that's really wonderful. It's pretty self-explanatory. The card is really strong and pretty broken in this deck, even though it's not a knight itself. Now, next up we have Oathsworn Knight, which is a 1 generic and 2 black human knight that comes into play with 4+1/+1 counters on it, and then it attacks each combat if able. And again, with a reconnaissance, this can help. And if damage will be dealt to him, it acts like an Hydra, basically removing a +1/+1 counter from him and then prevent all the damage. So it's a decent knight. It's not the greatest of knights, but again, with reconnaissance, it could be a cool idea to have him play, because then it's just a 4/4 knight that gets buffed by other tribal synergies, and it gets to stay there. Otherwise, you can always just bring him back into play with Sidar Jabari when it dies as a 4/4, so that's always good. Next up, you get the Banal Marshal, which is a 3/3 that buffs all your other creatures. So that's really, really good. Simple, explanatory, wonderful, especially because you have a lot of small creatures that want to become really big. And then we started having a look at the elemental knights from M20. The first one is the Cavalry of Gales, and this is, this is a 5/5 for 2 generic and 3 blue, so it's not an easy cast. It has flying, so that's always good. And when it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of the library in any order, and when it dies, you shuffle it into its owner's library. Now, the second part is annoying because you have to shuffle into the owner's library. But whenever it enters the battlefield, you get to draw 3 cards and rearrange any of the cards that you don't want on top of the library. And then maybe, if you have a fetch land, you can just break the fetch land and reorganize those lands, reorganize those cards wherever you want. Otherwise, it's not a bad card. Again, it's a 5/5 knight for 5 with flying. Otherwise, it's not a bad card. Then you get the Cavalier of Dawn, which is a vigilance 4/6 knight, and when it enters the battlefield, you destroy up to 1 target no-land permanent, and its controller creates, a golem, and then when it dies, you return an artifact or enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is very good in case somebody has board wiped your enchantments. You can always return him. It's a 4/6 with vigilance that can be really strong, and it can help you remove something off the board that needs removal. Next up, you get the Cavalier of Night, which is a 4/5 life flanker for 2 generic and 3 black. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature. When you do, you destroy target opponent creature, and then when it dies, you return target creature card with converted mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. Again, with Sidar Jabari, this is a great interaction. You can play these 2 knights, the last 2 ones better, because you get to return them to play. So that's really nice. Next up, you get the Knight of the Ebon Legion, which is a 1/2 vampire knight that you can buff up and give it Death Touch. And then at the beginning of your end step, if a player loses 4 or more life this turn, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So that's always good. It can grow really big, and then if you give it First Strike or any other abilities, it can really hurt people because you can just buff it up. It's a decent knight. It's not a groundbreaking knight, but it's good to have. Next up, you get Ayara's Oathsworn, which is from the new set from Aftermath, and I think this is a really good strong card. Has Menace 2/2, so that's always great. And then whenever it deals damage to a player, you will put a +1/+1 counter if it has less than 4 +1/+1 counters on it. And then if it has exactly 4 +1/+1 counters, you can search the library for any card and put it in your hand and shuffle. So it becomes a tutor at any one point. And again, all it has to do is deal damage to a player. So it's quite possible to do that. It can grow and become really annoying. And on top of that, with Sidar, if they remove it, as so long as they don't exile it, if she's dead in the graveyard, you can always bring her back, so that's really good. Next up, you get the Breathless Knight, which is a 2/2 flying lifelinker for 1 generic, 1 white, and 1 black. So this is a flying lifelinker that interacts with the second ability of Sidar, which is returning cards, knights from the graveyard into play, and whenever that happens, this knight gets a +1/+1 counter. That's always good. And again, flying and lifelink is really, really strong for a knight. And next up, you get Wander, which is a 2/2 incarnation, 3 generic and 1 blue. And you say, well, why do I need a non-knight creature here? Well, even though it's has flying and it's a 2/2, it looks a bit expensive. But then you look at what it does, and it says that as long as it's in your graveyard, the creatures, and you control an island, creatures you control have flying. And as I said, knights with flying are insanely strong. And if you can give all your knights flying, and again, you have to put this in your graveyard, so you can always chump block with it, you can definitely give flying to all of your creatures, which is insanely good. Next up, it's an interesting creature from the current set of March of the Machine. You get Knight Errant of Eos, which is a 4/4 human knight that has Convoke. So even though it costs 5, you can easily convoke him into play. And then when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 6 cards, and you can reveal up to 2 creatures cards with the mana value of X or less, where X is the number of creatures that help convoke the Errant Knight, and then you put the real cards into hand. It's nothing groundbreaking, you're not putting them into play, but it still is allowing you to look at the top 6 cards and I don't know, get 1 or 2 or 3 nice cards into your hand that you really want, so that's always nice. And then we continue with one card that was really surprised that it wasn't part of the deck proper, which is the Marshal of Zhalfir. It was introduced in March of the Machine, and I would reckon that they would have put it inside here, but for some reason they didn't decide to do that. It is a 2/2, a knight creature that gives all other knights that you control +1/+1, and allows you to tap another target creature. Very good card for this kind of deck, absolutely. Then from Phyrexian Beyond Commander Deck, you have the Sky Hunter Strike Force, a 2/2 cat knight with melee and flying, and lieutenant. So long as you control a commander, other creatures you control have melee. And in case you don't remember, melee gives +1/+1 counter to the creature with melee until the end of turn for each opponent that you've attacked this turn. So maximum of 3 +1/+1 counters. Always very good. Sorry, they're not counters, but yeah, you get 3 +1/+1 on any creature. It's always very good, and it buffs your creatures really well. Next up, we are looking at battles. Yes, battles have come in this set, and they're quite interesting. There are 2 battles that can really work well, especially the first one with this deck. The first one is the Invasion of Phyrexia, and it allows you to create X 2/2 white blue knight creatures tokens with vigilance, where X is how much you've paid. So if you have a lot of tithe treasure tokens, or you're trying to go wide later in the game, this is a great card. And it's only 6, so if you're playing the long game, it's not a bad card to try and kill off. Of course, because you want to go wide with this. And then it turns around and it becomes the Fairy Acosta of Zhalfir. And this Teferi is really good because -2 gives +1/+0 and ward 1 to all your knights for the rest of the game, because it gives you an emblem. And you can also draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, which is always good because of the interaction with all the draw cards that we do have. And then you can also tap X amount of knights to remove a threat on the board. So that's always nice. The second battle that we can be looking at to implement is the Invasion of Xerix, which the front really is not that strong. You just return up to 1 creature to an owner's hand, and you can also do it to yours if you have a good ETB that you want to re-enable. And then when it's turned around, which is not that hard to do with a 4, then it becomes a flying knight. Therefore, you get a knight that can get, buffed by all the tribal buff cards that you can have in game. That could be a 6/6 or 7/7 or whatever that has flying. It's insane. And I think this is something that I would definitely play. Next up, let's have a look at the artifacts. One of the things that we realized when looking at the deck was that it's lacking a lot into early game ramp of colors, or at least fixing of colors, you should say, because if your commander costs 4 and 3 of those colors are Esper, you definitely want to have those 3 colors as soon as possible to get Sidar Jabari in play ASAP. So the first one that we would play of the artifacts would be the Talisman of Progress, which, you know, it's a fairly common and it's basically a shotgun, but it's an artifact, and definitely that's a good buffer. Another one is the Dimir Signet, so that's a really decent way to, you know, cycle in an unwanted mana to be able to get the Dimir colors. You have the Talisman of Dominance as well for the Dimir colors, so that's very good. You get the Talisman of Hierarchy as well, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, is part of the deck, but anyway, I would still keep it in there. If it's not there, then just add it in, because that's something that you really want. And on top of that, you get the Azurus Signet as well, to allow you to cycle in the Azurius for fixing the mana. So these ones we would definitely play because the deck should be lacking on that end. Next up, if we look at more accessible things that you can do with the artifacts that you have, again, we're going for tribal artifacts. So we're looking at, for example, the Door of Destinies, which is an artifact that allows you to choose a creature type, and whenever a creature type of that type cast by yourself, you put a counter on this door, and the creatures of that type that you control get +1/+1 for each charge counter on the door. So that's a really good way to buff the whole thing. Another interesting one is the Thought Vessel, which can be kind of seen as an early game buffer, you know, because it allows you to kind of ramp. But the main reason why we're doing this is because you'll have a lot of draw, a lot of card draw synergies, and you'll want to have no maximum hand size as quickly as you can. You could also play the Reliquary Tower as a land, for example, to contravene that. Next up is Urza's Incubator. We use this in the tribal for Phyrexians, but yeah, I mean, it makes every single knight cost 2 generic less to cast, and even though the costing cast for a lot of knights is not as expensive, there are a lot of 2-cost or 3-costers. This card allows you to at least remove the generic part of those low costing knights, and that's always very good. Then you get the Coat of Arms, which allows you to put +1/+1, well, not a counter, it just allows you to give +1/+1 to all the creatures. The battlefield that shares at least a creature type with the creature that you with the creature itself. So basically, all your knights would get +1/+1 for each other creature on the battlefield that is a knight. So this is insane. It can rack up really quickly. Another good one is the Circle of Loyalty, which again, I'm not sure why they didn't want to put it in this precon deck, but maybe it would have been too strong. They did it in Dominaria United in the Commander decks, and this literally buffs up all your knight creatures, and of course the casting cost will be reduced depending on the amount of knights that you control. So it could be turn 3 Circle of Loyalty if you have a fairly decent curve, and then whenever you cast a legendary spell, so whenever you cast your commander, and there are some knights that are legendary in our list, you create a 2/2 white knight token, and then you get to create more nice tokens as well with vigilance. So this is just a great value, and if you have this, for example, and then you start flooding out or stuff like that, at least it allows you to put value on the board for yourself. Next up, we get the Icon of Ancestry, another tribal buffer that allows to give, you know, all your knights +1/+1. Again, it's yours, not the opponent's as well. And it also allows you to cycle through the top cards of your library, the top 3 cards, to go and fetch the knight that you want to put in your hand. And then you get the Vanquisher's Banner, which is again a great card that was reprinted from Ixalan in this current batch of decks. You get this in, if I'm not mistaken, this deck. So I would definitely 100% keep this card. It's insane because, you know, you draw more cards and it gives +1/+1 to all your knights. It's just synergistic. Next up, you get the Stoneforge Masterwork, which is an equipment that allows you to buff a specific creature for every other creature that shares, you know, the type. It gives him +1/+1 for that. So again, you can just buff a specific knight really strongly. And then I would, for last, I would also get the Chromatic Lantern, for just overall color smoothing. It's a great little card that allows you to tap any mana, any land for any mana color, so that's always good. Now let's have a look at the instance that we would play here. And again, the instance, just like the creature, they can only be a certain amount before you start becoming too overburdened, and you should have at least a certain amount to be able to see them to be impactful enough, right? So what we would advise you to do is to use this slot with caution, because in tribals you don't want to go overboard too much, but fill it in with all the cards that you can, that you think will fit in with what you've swapped into the precon. So always do that intelligently when you get to the instance and the sorceries. Now the first instance that we're looking at is the Ferris Protection. Phase out everything that is on your board. You get yourself covered for one turn. When you have a lot of knights and you've worked really hard to try and build up a presence, a board presence, you definitely want to be able to keep that board presence. And since we have a lot of enchantments and artifacts as well, this really helps you protect that, and it's definitely something that I would 100% use. Then next up you have the Anguished Unmaking. So this is my go-to Auras of removal, mainly because it allows you to exile any non-land permanent. So it's not only restricted to a couple of things, and that's always a plus on my. And then there's They Shall Know No Fear from the 40k decks, and this is a great little tribal interaction that allows you to give indestructible and +1/+0 to those creatures. It's good to go wide, but it's also good to just protect them from a distract board wipe. Another great protection from destruction is Flawless Maneuver, which is just wonderful because if you have your command in play, it costs you nothing and you can just cast it for free. So definitely something that we can use. One card that I don't know if you want to use it, but it's there because it's part of the stronger Esper colors, is Fierce Guardianship, which is a counter spell that costs you nothing if you have your commander in play. Again, I wouldn't go too heavy on the counter spells, but if it's something that you have and you don't have any of the other ones, then the other instance, I mean, then definitely that's something that you might want to think about using. Next up, you get Deadly Dispute, which we use in our Phyrexian Tribal, and this is great because, yeah, you sack a creature, hopefully you get it back with your commander's ability, and it allows you to draw 2 cards and create a treasure token, and that's a really, really good card overall. And then you also get another great card that I like to use in tribals, which is a Chroma's Will. It buffs everything on the board, and if you get your commander, it just does everything all at once, and it's the, go wide and go home kind of strategy to win the game with tribals, and I really love that. Next, we have the tutors. 2 tutors that I always advise to use. Now, granted, you don't always have to use both of them. I would at least use the Vampiric Tutor because it allows you to get any card whatsoever and put that card on top of your library. But, if you don't want to go for that, then you can just go for the Enlightened Tutor. And again, you have a lot of enchantments and artifacts in this deck that really can pop up your tribal really quickly. But if you don't want to play with tutors and this is something that you really don't like, then just forego this part. Another interesting one that is usually lower on the list of interaction for drawing cards is Frantic Surge. And the good part about this one is because our commander is sort of a reanimator, then you can discard 2 really big, knights that you wouldn't otherwise be able to play, and you get the draw and untap, and then you can just put them into play that way. So this is a good alternative. Next up, another protection spell is Clever Concealment. So again, you don't have to play all 3 protection spells, but necessarily I would on this kind of trouble deck because you are spending a lot of time building this tribal presence. So the Clever Concealment really allows for your deck to be protected, and you can convoke it with the knights, and you phase out any non-land permanents that you control. So that's really good protection value for yourself. Another good removal that you could play that destroys non-land permanent is Void Rend, which cannot be countered. Fairly simple, and it doesn't have any drawbacks, but you need Esper to actually play it. And then lastly, because of the kind of reanimator effect of, well, it is not kind of, it is a reanimator effect on Sidar Jabari, the Entomb. Entomb is a good card where you are gonna go and fetch that one knight that you really want in play the next turn or this turn. You attack with Sidar Jabari, and there you go. You've done the thing, and you can bring back, I don't know, a really good knight in play. So next up we have the sorceries, and the first one that I will use is Supreme Verdict. Again, the sorceries, the way that I envision sorceries and instants are just tools to get you either quicker, protected, or to board wipe and interact with your enemies in this kind of decks. So, and I mean, in the end, that this is what sorcery instants are when you break them down to the simplest form. But realistically, the Supreme Verdict is one of the first things that you want to do. It destroys all creatures. It doesn't cost too much, and it's great. Second, really good one, but it is really expensive, is the Kindred Dominance, because it allows you to select a specific type of creature and destroy everything else. That's all the other creatures that aren't of that type. It's really expensive for what it does, but at the same time, it allows you to protect your creatures from actually dying when you're board wiping, which is usually what happens, right? Next up, you get the Pact of the Serpent, which is kind of a Smitten Sword Master Curry Favor type of thing, where you choose a creature type and target player draws X cards and loses X life, where X is the number of creatures that you control of that type. So that's not a bad card. You can mill out your opponents, or for yourself, you can also go and get a lot of value out of this. Yes, you'll lose life, but you'll be drawing a lot of cards. And if you have anything that allows you to have no maximum hand size, that's even better. Another great sorcery for this kind of travel deck is Patriarch's Bidding, and namely because you choose a creature type and you can return all the knights onto play. And of course, the downside of that is that your opponents can do the same, but realistically, unless they're playing, well, you get unlucky, you play against other tribals, you can't do much about it. But if they're not playing tribals, then they will get maybe 1, 2 creatures, depending on. There will be their strongest creatures for sure, but it's still a good card to have. Another great removal is Farewell. This is a great removal that I always use on all of my white decks. It's just insanely strong, being able to choose which specific things you want to exile depending on what the board state is and how far ahead certain opponents have gotten. That's really good. I've had games where just being able to exile all enchantments and nothing else has saved all 3 players, not just myself, so that's been really good. Another good card is Buried Alive, again because of the reanimator effect. You search three creature cards, you put them into your graveyard, and then slowly with Sidar you just bring them back into play. And lastly, there's always the Demonic Tutor, which allows you to go for whatever card you want and then put it into your hand. Always something that I like to play in my black decks. Now, regarding the Planeswalkers, the only Planeswalker that I could think of that has synergies that are really good with the knights without taking too many slots out of the decent knights is Gideon, ally of Zendikar. And this is mainly because you put a knights into play and also you get an emblem. So what you can do is, +1 it, becomes a 5/5 soldier. Hopefully it survives that, and then the next turn you -4 it, give all your creatures +1/+1, and then slowly, you're done. Basically, he's done his job, and then if he stays as a body on the battlefield to create more tokens, that's great. If not, you still buffed up your whole entire tribe. Okay, so now we'll be looking at the lands, and as usual, for the land slot, we don't really go into detail as to, whatever specific lands you will use for the colors because, I mean, there are so many variations going from the original dual lands, so the scrub lands, for example, or the tundra. There are a lot of really good lands, but depending on your budget and your collection, those lands are costing a lot, right? So that part we kind of leave up to you to fix. You could just realistically go with normal lands you can think of, and if you don't have any dual lands and you just have the ones in the deck, then you can remove the fodder ones that we saw that are kind of not so good, and then just replace them with basic lands and the utility lands that we'll be talking about here. So first and foremost, the first one is the Cavern of Souls. It allows you to choose a creature type, and it's a great trouble um, land because you can use any mana of any color by tapping it to pay for those creatures' costs, and that's really, really good. And it's definitely something that you use in all tribals. Another good utility land is the Reliquary Tower. Just like the Vessel, this one allows you to have no maximum hand size, and when you have a deck that allows you to draw so much, this is something that you really want to have. Another good one is the Vault of the Archangel, which allows you to give Death Touch and Lifelink to the creatures you control. And you go wide, you do that, you've pumped your creatures as much as you can, and that's going to be a deadly, deadly thing. And it just stays in play as long as it's not removed from a wasteland or something like that. So it's really, really good. Another decent one that you could use that I don't really necessarily think is one of the better ones to use, but it's an okay utility land. I mean, it gets a lot of play in other formats such as Pioneer. But the Ganjo or Ganja, Seed of the Empire, that allows you to deal 4 damage. Channel it, you deal 4 damage, and it costs 1 less when you channel it for a legendary creature you control. It's not bad. Alternatively, it's just a plains. It's not a bad card. It's definitely playable, especially early game if it falls into your hand. Just like the Takenuma Abandoned Mire. This one synergizes with the mill part and the reanimate part of your deck, so that's really, really good. The rest of the utility lands, you could always go for Orborg if necessary, and then you could play with the Cabal Coffers as usual. But realistically, you just want to be playing your creatures easily, so you don't want to be messing up too much with fancy lands that do too much. You just want to have the colors ready to be able to play your creatures quickly because the main deck is about getting those knights out, and most of them don't cost too much. For our tech upgrade for this precon deck, again, I think this is a really strong deck. Knights have had presence in Magic the Gathering since the first, outing of Magic the Gathering with the Black and White Knight. So it's been an interesting journey to be able to look at knights throughout history. On Scryfall, I was just looking at all the knights that have ever been made and trying to condense them into what the best ones could be and how you better synergize with this. Realistically, there are a lot of knights out there, and even if you just play a simple, not too many value cards, but just simple knights that are low cost, you can definitely still get a lot of fun out of this tribal deck, I believe. And yeah, that's it. I think this is a fun deck. It's not my alley of kind of theme, but it's definitely something that a lot of players will enjoy playing. And hopefully, the advice that we've given you today will be able to make your deck stronger, or at least have you think about your deck in different ways and about the commander in different ways. And who knows, maybe we gave you a couple of things you didn't know about that you could do, and a couple of ideas to try out later on. So that's all we wanted to do. And that's it from us. If you like these kind of videos, please let us know. It helps our channel a lot if you like and click on the subscribe button, you comment down beneath, hit that bell notification, all the usual stuff. For small channels like us, it helps us immensely. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts if you made it this far, and if you looked at our video. We really are excited to get going and doing more of these videos, so you'll hopefully see more coming along. And until then, from Scotty and I, this was fun. So be good, be kind, have a good day, a blessed day, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!